My dad used to wake us up super early on random Saturday mornings and announce, "Adventure Day." We'd pile into our old blue van, my mom jokingly called it the Mystery Machine, and drive for a few hours to nearby towns. These trips always revolved around what Dad called forgotten places, abandoned factories, closed hospitals, half-finished construction sites, and empty buildings left to rot. Dad packed little backpacks for each of us, flashlights, gloves, water, and snacks. We'd park a few blocks away and sneak in through broken fences or side entrances. To me, it felt like normal family bonding. I even bragged about it at elementary school and got a weird look from my teacher, but I didn't think much of it. There were rules. No posting pictures online. Privacy, basically. Whisper inside buildings. If we saw someone, use our code word, banana, and leave immediately. Each of us could take one small item as a keepsake, but only if it was obviously broken or abandoned. And we weren't to tell anyone the exact locations. Finn, my brother, collected those little items. Rusted signs, a shard of decorative tile from an old hotel, and Mom helped him arrange them in shadow boxes. I wasn't as interested in collecting, but I loved exploring and the adrenaline of being somewhere we shouldn't be. When I was about 14, I was at my friend Maria's house. Her dad is a police officer. I casually mentioned that my family might go exploring that weekend. The look on his face was something I'll never forget. He carefully asked if we had permission to enter those buildings. I said no, they were abandoned. He explained that we were actually doing breaking and entering and trespassing, crimes. I was stunned. In my head, abandoned meant fair game. He told me even if we didn't break anything, it was still illegal. He also explained that taking souvenirs could be theft. I went home shaken and confused. My childhood hobby, apparently criminal. My parents, otherwise, seemed normal. Dad worked in accounting. Mom volunteered at church. I tried to raise the subject casually with Mom, "Hey, about our adventures," and she cut the conversation short. That made me suspect they'd known it was illegal for a long time. A few months later, adventure days became less frequent. Dad said he was busy with work. I assumed they were phasing it out once I knew. Then last month, Dad announced a special night trip. An amazing abandoned mansion about 2 hours away, supposedly safe and perfect. Finn was ecstatic. I was uneasy, but I didn't want to miss out. This place felt different. It was a massive mansion, apparently abandoned mid-renovation. Tools everywhere, half-finished walls, but also some furnished rooms. It felt less like a derelict building and more like a workspace where someone was actively renovating. While we were exploring the library, Finn found a small wooden box hidden behind books. Inside was expensive-looking jewelry, real gold and gemstones, not costume pieces. Dad's reaction was intense. He told Finn to put it in his backpack immediately. I said that wasn't a harmless souvenir. It was someone's valuables. He snapped at me. Then a car pulled up outside. Dad went pale and grabbed Mom's arm. She looked terrified. We started moving toward a back staircase, and I realized this wasn't an abandoned property at all, but a house under renovation, someone's home. As we rushed, a flashlight beam hit us, and a voice shouted, "Stop right there!" A security guard pointed a light, then banged his flashlight against the wall. In the moment, it sounded like a gunshot. I was terrified. Mom screamed. I wet myself. Dad pushed me behind him and yelled, "Don't shoot! We have kids!" The guard called the police and ordered us to sit while he radioed for backup. He demanded to know what was in our backpacks. Finn pulled out the jewelry box and started crying. The guard reported a theft over the radio. When the police arrived, everyone was separated for questioning. I told them everything about decades of adventure days and the souvenirs we'd taken. The officers looked more disturbed as I spoke. We were taken to the station. I've never seen my parents so frightened. Mom sobbed. Dad kept trying to speak, but the officers didn't let him. The police called my Aunt Patricia to pick me and Finn up since our parents were detained. Aunt Patricia arrived in disbelief. "What the hell is going on?" she asked. "How do you explain that your church-going, tax-paying parents had been taking you into places and teaching you to trespass?" The drive to Patricia's was silent, except for Finn's breakdown. At her house, she made us shower and gave us clean clothes, then told us our parents were in big trouble, charged with breaking and entering, attempted burglary, and child endangerment. Child endangerment. The same parents who made sure we wore helmets and had emergency plans were now accused of criminal behavior. That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed every adventure day, the backpacks, the treasure hunts, the picnics afterward. All of it could have gotten us arrested, hurt, or worse. The next morning, Patricia whispered that Dad was being held on bond and Mom was released to get us. The jewelry we'd found was valued at over $50,000, and the house belonged to a wealthy family renovating it. When Mom arrived, she looked hollow. She hugged us tight and said, "Last night was a terrible mistake. The other places were abandoned. Those trips were different. But your father made a very bad choice." I lost control. I screamed that every adventure had been illegal and accused her of lying. Patricia had to pull me off. Finn was frozen, staring like he didn't recognize anyone. Mom cried that she hadn't wanted to hear the truth. Overwhelmed, I locked myself in Patricia's guest room for hours. Patricia eventually convinced me to come out. Mom said she needed to take us home for clothes since we might have to stay with Patricia for a while. The police would be back to question us. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Inside, Mom told us the truth. Dad had a problem. He'd always been attracted to places he shouldn't go. At first, it was genuinely abandoned spots. Over time, he began taking small items to sell, then larger ones. Mom said she tried to stop him, but he convinced her it was harmless and that the money helped when times were tough. I couldn't believe it. All those times Dad left during an adventure, all those rooms we waited in, it had been part of his pattern. Mom explained that he claimed the money made him feel alive and helped the family, paying for vacations, my dance lessons, Finn's private schooling. I realized then that many things in our lives were funded by stolen goods. I threw up. The police returned an hour later with 2 officers and a Child Protective Services representative. CPS asked if we ever felt in danger. I didn't know how to answer. I never felt threatened by my parents, but the buildings had been dangerous. Had I nearly fallen through rotted floors? Maybe. When asked if I knew it was wrong, I said no. I only learned a few months ago from Maria's dad and still didn't grasp the severity. The CPS worker wrote everything down and said Finn and I could stay with her for now while they investigated. The morning after we were caught, police executed a search warrant at our house, 5 police cars, and neighbors watching like it was a spectacle. The detective told us Dad had been doing this for years, using adventure days as a cover to scout properties where he could return later to steal valuables. The detective pointed at Finn's shadow boxes and said they might be stolen property. Finn lost it and lunged when the officer tried to bag them as evidence. I watched him break down over items he'd always thought were harmless keepsakes. The police cataloged items throughout our home, an antique mirror, a grandfather clock, a record player Dad gave me for my birthday, stuff linked to burglaries. I couldn't look at my room without wondering what was stolen. Aunt Patricia confronted Mom in the backyard, furious, and Mom finally broke down. She admitted Dad had initially targeted abandoned places, but once financial strain hit, he began taking items from vacant but valuable properties. She said the souvenirs were a way to normalize their activity for the kids, so we wouldn't question it. By then, the extra income had become a financial dependency, paying for lessons, sports, and family trips. After the police left, they took boxes from our house. Mom wasn't arrested, but was called in for more questioning. We couldn't stay at home. It was a crime scene. Patricia took us back to her place. The next day at school was brutal. Word spread fast. People stared and whispered. My friend Maria tried to act normal, but seemed uncomfortable. At lunch, a girl named Teresa, someone I barely knew, asked if Dad was a professional burglar. I snapped and told her to mind her own business, then stormed out and wandered the town, thinking about every building that might have been targeted. When I returned to Patricia's, Mom had been released and came to see us, but she couldn't take us home yet. Finn ran into her arms, distraught about his collections. Later, Mom told us Dad's bail was set very high. He faced multiple felony charges. Our house would likely need to be sold to pay restitution and legal fees. We might have to change schools. CPS was investigating. Everything felt shattered. Mom and I visited Dad in jail. Seeing him in an orange jumpsuit made him look years older. I asked him why. He told me he wanted to give us a life he never had. When he was a child, his family had nothing. When he lost his job, he found another way to provide. He said he never wanted us to know. Hearing that, I wanted to shout that I'd rather have grown up poor than with criminal behavior as a foundation. But I couldn't make the words come out. Instead, I sat, trying to reconcile the man who taught me to ride a bike with the man in front of me. Back at Patricia's, Finn asked if returning the souvenirs could reduce Dad's bail. Mom cried. Later, I overheard Patricia and Mom saying the police had tied Dad to at least 7 break-ins across 3 counties. Mom repeated that he'd promised the places were abandoned. That night, Finn rummaged in my backpack. I caught him with a small gold locket he'd taken from Patricia's jewelry box. He cried, "It's just like the adventures. I wanted something normal again." It hit me. Dad hadn't just stolen objects. He'd warped our sense of right and wrong. The court hearing came and went, and it was awful in the way you'd expect. We wore our nicest clothes, like we were going to church, while Dad appeared in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit. The prosecutor listed charges: breaking and entering, burglary, theft, possession of stolen property, and contributing to the delinquency of minors. That last one hit me hardest. Dad pled guilty in a flat voice. His lawyer argued Dad had been desperate to provide and hadn't been violent. The judge listened, and victims spoke. An older couple who owned the mansion we broke into described the emotional damage: family heirlooms gone, sleepless nights, a stolen wedding ring that couldn't be replaced. It was crushing to hear the human side of what Dad had done. When sentencing came, the judge didn't hold back. 5 years in prison for Dad, plus probation and restitution. The stolen goods linked to him totaled over $200,000. We left in a daze. Mom collapsed in the hallway, sobbing that we didn't know how we'd survive. We held Finn's hand and felt like our future evaporated. Afterward, life became a blur of paperwork, meetings, and upheaval. The house essentially had to be sold to start paying restitution. A financial advisor told Mom we were in trouble. We had 2 weeks to move. Sorting through our belongings was unbearable, trying to figure out what belonged to us and what might be evidence of a crime. Mom kept discovering items she suspected were taken from other homes. We left many things behind to avoid accidentally keeping stolen property. School was hell. People whispered and pointed. Teresa and her group called me names and taunted me about stealing. One day, Teresa mocked a bracelet Dad had given me for my 14th birthday and loudly suggested I'd stolen it. Something snapped. I shoved her, we fought, and it took 2 teachers to separate us. Both of us were suspended for 3 days. During that suspension, more of the legal fallout unfolded. The detective interviewed us again. CPS scheduled follow-ups. Mom worked with a lawyer. There were conversations about custody and what would happen to Finn and me if Mom couldn't provide. My sense of safety and normalcy felt gone. Over time, people around me reacted in different ways, some with sympathy, others with judgment. Finn shut down. He missed his collections and the routines of our old life. I felt betrayed and furious. Mom oscillated between guilt and practical concern, how to keep us afloat and deal with the consequences. Looking back, the thing that hurts most is the rewriting of memory. Every adventure day, every picnic, every hug felt tainted. The artifacts of childhood that once seemed innocent now carried the weight of criminality. My parents, who had once seemed reliably ordinary and safe, became complicated in ways I couldn't reconcile. Dad's sentence meant we had to rebuild. There were meetings with social workers, decisions about school, and financial crises to manage. Mom started working with an attorney and a financial planner. She had to face the reality that many of the things we'd relied on were funded by theft. As the weeks passed, legal proceedings continued, restitution amounts were calculated, and family ties strained. Some neighbors avoided us, others offered help. Aunt Patricia did what she could. Finn clung to the few normal things left, school friends, routines, but it was clear nothing would be the same. In the aftermath, I'm left grappling with how to remember my past. Do I keep the parts that were real, the closeness, the sense of adventure, or only remember the harm and illegality underlying it? There's no easy answer. What I do know is this: my childhood, as I understood it, was built on a pattern I didn't recognize until it all came crashing down. And now, I'm learning how to separate memory from the consequences of my father's choices. There were police cars outside our house, and our neighbors stood around watching like it was some twisted show. Mom tried to stay calm, but her hands shook so badly she could barely get the front door unlocked. While officers searched the place, a detective sat us down in the kitchen and explained that Dad had been at this for years, longer than I ever imagined. The so-called adventure days were really his cover. He would scope out places, figure out if they had valuables, then return later alone to steal them. The detective kept pressing us about what we knew. Mom insisted over and over that Finn and I had no part in it. Then he pointed to all of Finn's shadow boxes on his bedroom wall and asked, "What about these?" That's when Finn lost control. He shouted that they were just souvenirs, broken little things no one wanted. But when the detective started bagging them as evidence, Finn lunged at him. Mom had to hold him back while he sobbed uncontrollably. I could only watch my brother fall apart over items he didn't even realize were stolen. Soon the police were pointing out pieces all over our house: the antique mirror, the grandfather clock in the dining room, even the old record player Dad had given me for my birthday. All of it was stolen. I couldn't look around my own room without wondering if everything in it came from a crime. Aunt Patricia showed up during the search and pulled Mom outside into the backyard. I followed because I needed to hear what they were going to say. Patricia was furious, more than I'd ever seen her. She got right in Mom's face and demanded, "How could you let this happen? How could you drag the kids into this? What kind of mother does that?" That's when Mom finally broke. She collapsed into a patio chair and told us everything. She explained that Dad had always been into urban exploration, even before they met. Back then, it was just abandoned places. But after they got married and money got tight, especially when Dad lost his job when I was about 4, he began taking small things to sell. Mom admitted she confronted him, but he convinced her it was harmless, just forgotten items no one cared about. But over time, it escalated. By the time I was 10, he was targeting empty properties that still had valuable things inside. The adventure days became a way to disguise it as a family activity, to make it seem exciting instead of criminal. Mom said she wanted to stop many times, but by then we depended on the extra money. My dance lessons, Finn's soccer, even our family vacations, they'd all been funded by stolen goods. I stared at her, disgusted. So everything in our lives, our memories, our celebrations, was built on theft? Every happy moment tied back to crime? Mom couldn't even look at me. Patricia tried to comfort me, but I pushed her away. I didn't want sympathy. I wanted back the last 15 years of my life. When the police finally left, they took box after box of items from our house. Mom wasn't arrested, but they said she'd have to come in for more questioning. Since the house was now considered a crime scene, we couldn't stay there. Patricia took us to her place for the night. The next day at school was brutal. Word had already spread, and everyone was staring and whispering. My friend Maria tried to act normal, but even she seemed uneasy. At lunch, a girl named Teresa, someone I'd never even spoken to before, walked right up to my table. She asked, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Is it true your dad's a professional burglar? My mom says your whole house is full of stolen stuff." I snapped. I slammed my hands on the table and shouted at her to mind her own business. The cafeteria went silent. I grabbed my backpack, stormed out, and skipped the rest of the day. I wandered around town for hours, staring at buildings and houses, wondering if Dad had ever broken into them. When I finally went back to Patricia's, Mom was waiting. She'd been released after questioning, but wasn't allowed to take us home yet. She tried to hug me, but I pulled away. Finn, on the other hand, ran straight into her arms, crying about how they took all his collections. That night, Mom told us Dad's bail had been set. It was ridiculously high, though his lawyer was trying to get it lowered. She warned us to prepare for what was coming. Dad was facing multiple felony charges. Our house might have to be sold to cover legal fees and restitution. We might even need to switch schools, and Child Protective Services was still investigating. I couldn't process any of it. All I could think was that my entire childhood had been a lie. The next day, Mom took us to see Dad in jail. I didn't want to go, but Patricia said I needed closure. The jail looked nothing like it does in movies. It was sterile and depressing, with fluorescent lights that made everyone look sick. When Dad walked in, wearing an orange jumpsuit, I barely recognized him. He looked at least 10 years older. He tried to act normal, asking about school and how we were doing at Patricia's. Mom kept the conversation light, but I couldn't play along. Finally, I blurted out, "Why did you do it? Why did you make us part of it?" Dad's expression changed. He leaned forward and told me something I'll never forget. He wanted to give us the life he never had. He said when he was young, his family had nothing, and he swore his kids would have everything. After losing his job, he couldn't provide, so he found another way. I wanted to scream that I'd rather have grown up poor than with a criminal father, but the words wouldn't come. I just sat there, staring at this stranger in an orange jumpsuit, trying to reconcile him with the man who once taught me to ride a bike and checked under my bed for monsters. Before the visit ended, Dad looked straight at me and said, "I never wanted you kids to know. The souvenirs, the adventures, that was supposed to be the fun part. The rest?" His voice trailed off, and for the first time, I saw real shame in his eyes. On the way back to Patricia's, Finn asked if Dad's bail could be lowered if we returned all the souvenirs we'd collected. Mom just started crying silently, which made Finn cry too. I sat by the window, feeling nothing but a hollow ache where my family used to be. Dad's court hearing went about as badly as expected. We had to put on our nicest clothes, which felt absurd, since we were really there to watch our family unravel. The courthouse was cold and intimidating, making me feel like I was the one on trial. Mom kept fussing with Finn's collar and smoothing my hair, like we were heading to church, not about to hear our father plead guilty to multiple felonies. The courtroom was smaller and far more intimidating than TV makes it seem. Other families were there too, each looking just as miserable. When Dad's case was called, my stomach dropped. He shuffled in, wearing an orange jumpsuit with chains on his ankles. He looked so ordinary, nothing like someone who'd been breaking into homes for over a decade. The prosecutor listed out the charges: multiple counts of burglary, theft, possession of stolen property, and one that hit me hardest, contributing to the delinquency of minors. That was us. When the judge asked for his plea, Dad answered guilty in a flat, lifeless voice I had never heard before. His lawyer tried to argue that Dad was desperate, that he only wanted to provide for his family, that he'd never been violent. But the judge's expression never softened. Then victims were invited to speak. I hadn't realized they'd be there. An older couple stood up, the owners of the mansion we'd broken into. The woman cried as she described how violated she felt, unable to sleep in her own home. Her husband spoke about heirlooms that could never be replaced, including his mother's wedding ring. I wanted to disappear. These weren't faceless buildings. They were real people whose lives had been shaken. I looked at Mom, tears streaming down her face, while Finn sat completely shut down. When it came time for sentencing, the judge was direct. 5 years in prison for Dad, plus probation after. On top of that, restitution. The value of items tied to him totaled more than $200,000. $200,000. I had no idea how we'd ever repay it. Afterward, we weren't even allowed to speak to him. They just led him away. In the hallway, Mom collapsed into Patricia's arms, sobbing about how we would survive. I stood there holding Finn's hand, feeling like my future had been erased. The way to move forward was to show stability, financial, emotional, and physical. I asked what we could do to help, and she just gave me a sad smile. She said we'd already lost enough of our childhood because of their mistakes, and she didn't want us taking on adult problems anymore. But how could we avoid it? Our entire lives had already been overturned. One morning, I found Mom sitting at the kitchen table with bills spread out and her checkbook in hand, quietly crying. When she noticed me, she quickly wiped her eyes and forced a smile. I sat across from her and asked directly if she had known what Dad was doing. She buried her face in her hands and stayed silent for so long I thought she wouldn't respond. Eventually, she admitted that she had sensed something was wrong. She said she avoided looking too closely because she was afraid of the truth and of losing everything. But now, she said, we'd lost it anyway. Dad was in prison. Our old life was gone. Mom was struggling to keep us afloat. Finn was battling what Dad had taught him, and I was left trying to figure out who I was, knowing everything I believed about our family had been built on lies. Sometimes I still missed those so-called adventures. I'd catch myself looking at buildings and wondering what was inside. Dad's voice still lingered in my head, pointing out entryways and valuables. I worried that whatever drove him might be inside me too. Years passed. I never thought I'd post another update, but here I am. Dad was released from prison 3 weeks ago, and all the feelings I thought I'd resolved came rushing back. For anyone who needs a recap, when I was 15, I discovered that our family adventure days exploring abandoned buildings were actually a cover for Dad's burglaries. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. We lost our home and my mom. My brother Finn and I had to start over. The years after were difficult. We eventually left the gloomy apartment and moved into a modest townhouse once Mom got promoted at the dental office. I worked through high school, earned scholarships, and first attended community college before transferring to a state university, where I'm now finishing a psychology degree. My choice of field wasn't random. Having a criminal father and a brother drawn to theft played a role. Finn struggled through high school. He was caught shoplifting twice. The second time, the store owner recognized our last name and made a remark, like father, like son. I wanted to disappear. Mom put Finn in therapy, which helped to a degree, but sometimes I still saw that unsettling gleam in his eyes when he spotted something valuable. While Dad was in prison, we exchanged letters occasionally. At first, they were about surface topics, school, the weather, books I was reading. But I never visited him again after the first year. Seeing him in an orange jumpsuit was too difficult. I couldn't reconcile the man who taught me to ride a bike with the man who turned me into an accomplice. As his release approached, Mom started mentioning him moving back in with her and Finn. They never divorced, partly because of her religious beliefs, partly because of the cost. By then, I had moved into an apartment with roommates. When Mom told me her plan, I lost it. I asked how she could even consider letting him back after everything. We argued in her kitchen, and I reminded her how much he had taken from us. Our home, our security, her years of exhausting work. For the first time, I saw a new look on her face. She told me that William had paid his debt to society, and if God could forgive him, then so could she. I stormed out and didn't speak to her for almost 2 weeks. Finn texted me, saying I was being unfair, that Dad deserved another chance. But Finn had been only 14 when it all happened. He still saw Dad as a hero. I was 15, old enough to recognize the betrayal and understand how he had trained us without our knowledge. The day before Dad's release, Mom called and asked me to attend a welcome home dinner. I told her I needed more time. She cried and said she couldn't handle it without me. Eventually, I agreed, but only for her sake. That whole week, I dreaded it. What could I possibly say? Welcome back, Dad? How was prison? Thanks for destroying my childhood and giving me trust issues. When Sunday came, I sat in my car for 20 minutes before forcing myself to go in. Dad looked older, thinner, gray-haired, but still familiar. He stood when I entered, unsure if he should hug me. I just gave a brief wave. Dinner was strained. Mom filled the silence with small talk about neighbors and church friends. Finn stayed quiet. Dad asked about school, and I answered briefly. I could feel Mom's eyes on me, begging me to try harder. After dinner, she asked Finn to help with dishes, leaving Dad and me in the living room. We avoided eye contact until he finally said he knew I was angry. He didn't expect forgiveness, but he hoped we could at least be civil. I meant to just nod and leave, but instead I asked if he had any idea what he'd done, not just financially, but how he twisted our sense of right and wrong. I told him I still had nightmares about break-ins, that I heard his voice whenever I saw an abandoned building, that I constantly second-guessed myself in fear I had inherited his mindset. He sat quietly, his face pained. When I finished, he admitted something I hadn't expected. In prison, he'd spent a lot of time thinking. His own father had grown up poor, bitter toward those with more, and when Dad lost his job, those feelings came back. The resentment, the desperation. But he insisted the adventures had been real. He really did love exploring with us. He just compartmentalized, separating family time from crime in his mind. The next day, Dad texted asking to meet for coffee. Mom had given him my number. I agreed, preferring neutral ground. He was already there when I arrived, with a small notebook. He slid it across the table and explained it was a record of every place he had broken into, everything he had taken. He had already turned it in to his parole officer. I asked why he was showing me. He said he wanted to be transparent, that honesty was part of his recovery. I opened it reluctantly. Page after page detailed homes, dates, and stolen items. Some entries included notes about the impact, family heirlooms, devastated children, people grieving lost memories. It was worse than I imagined. When I asked if Mom or Finn had seen it, he said no. He wanted me to see it first, since I had been the one to confront him years ago. We ended up talking for hours about prison, my college life, Finn's struggles. At one point, I asked if he missed the thrill. He admitted he sometimes did, that it was like an addiction he'd always have to resist. That terrified me most, the idea that relapse was possible. He assured me therapy and parole conditions kept him accountable, but promises from him didn't hold much weight anymore. At the next family dinner, he mentioned a historical building downtown, describing its architecture with familiar excitement. Finn's eyes lit up just like they had during childhood adventures. Without thinking, I asked if he had told his parole officer about his interest. The table went silent. Dad said he was only appreciating the design, but Finn accused me of not giving him a chance. Mom looked embarrassed. I pushed back, reminding them that real people were still suffering because of his crimes. Finn defended Dad, insisting he deserved a fresh start. Finally, Dad interrupted, admitting I was right to be cautious. He told Finn directly that what he had done wasn't just illegal, but morally wrong, that he had hurt people and violated their homes. For the first time, he fully acknowledged the damage without excuses. Mom teared up, and Finn looked conflicted. Later that night, Dad pulled me aside. He admitted he was worried about Finn, that his son still romanticized the crimes. He asked for my help guiding him. I agreed, but made it clear it was for Finn's sake, not his. Over the next weeks, life settled into a fragile routine. Dad kept up with therapy and parole. Mom was less stressed with his income, and Finn prepared for community college. Then came the first parole violation. He missed a check-in after crossing county lines to look at an abandoned factory. He claimed he hadn't broken in, just observed from outside. His parole officer issued a warning, but for Mom and me, it reignited fears. That night, I told Mom she needed to accept the reality. Dad might never fully change. She admitted she had noticed his old, calculating look when he saw certain buildings. For the first time, she and I were aligned. A few days later, Dad called me to meet at a park. He apologized for the violation and handed me the notebook again, this time filled with plans for change. The steps looked serious and thoughtful, but I couldn't tell if it was genuine or just another performance. He admitted it would take more than words to rebuild trust, but he wanted to try, not just for Mom and Finn, but also for himself, and if I allowed, for me. I told him I needed time. I couldn't erase the past or its impact, but I couldn't ignore his effort either. As I left, he reminded me of how I used to notice details on our adventures: gargoyles, carvings, hidden designs. He said that part of me was real, and it didn't have to be tainted by what he had done. There isn't a neat conclusion. I don't know what comes next. I don't know if Dad will stay on track or if old habits will return. I don't know if Mom will hold him accountable or continue excusing him.